our next guest is Thomas Jipping, who is the Deputy Director and Senior Legal Fellow of the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Thomas, welcome to Breitbart News Tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Thomas, let's talk about the cases today. The Little Sisters of the Poor finally won. They had a big victory.
Actually, they won again. The opinion, Justice Thomas's opinion detailed almost 9 years of effort on their part for one very simple goal, and that is that this group of nuns wouldn't be forced to pay for birth control that they believe violates their religious beliefs. You'd think that that's to them very important, but you'd think that's a very minor, easy thing. And the Obama administration was determined by hook or by crook to make these nuns violate their religious beliefs. And the Little Sisters hung tough and stuck with it. And this is the second case has been to the Supreme Court, and they finally won again. And we can only hope that this is the end of this litigation for them.
Their travails. Yeah, now it was a 7-2 decision. And as you mentioned, Justice Thomas wrote the court's decision. And brilliant, as always, is all of his decisions. I'm a big Justice Thomas fan. But, I mean, this is protecting their religious faith. That they can't be forced to do something against their religious faith in this. I mean, why was this controversial in the first place?
Well, if you remember Obamacare, which is almost 10 years ago, that law required employers to cover preventive services in their health plans, but they didn't define what that is. An executive branch agency defined that as all forms of birth control approved by the FDA. Well, of course, as faithful Catholics, they believe that use of birth control is immoral. And so all they asked for was simply an accommodation to not have that requirement applied to them. That's all. And the Obama administration was determined that something that we believe is as important as religious freedom was not going to stand in the way of whatever agenda they were trying to push with this birth control mandate. And so they 3 different times they issued regulations claiming that they were trying to accommodate the religious beliefs of groups like the Little Sisters. All of it was a sham. And the Little Sisters, they weren't going to take it, and they went to court. And they vindicated a very important principle that when the government enacts public policy, they need to respect and find ways to accommodate as much as possible the fundamental right to practice religion.
Now, in their dissent, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice Sonia Sotomayor said that the court was basically, with this decision, was just leaving women workers to fend for themselves, to seek contraceptive coverage from other sources, aside from their employer's insurer. Wasn't there a explain that to us.
Well, I'll have to say that both of those are two of the most disingenuous opinions by any Supreme Court justice that I recall in my 30-plus years in Washington. Those two justices know very well that this ruling was very narrow, and it applied only to groups like the Little Sisters of the Poor. It left alone the requirement to cover birth control certainly by non-religious employers and by many religious employers who didn't fit certain criteria. They knew very well that this was a specific, narrow accommodation that this particular group was seeking, and yet they said, oh my goodness, if we give this one little accommodation to this group of nuns, everything's going to be coming crashing down. That's a lie, and they know it. It was really kind of discouraging to read, because it's one thing to take a different legal position, but they completely misrepresented what this case was about and what was at stake. I mean, we're talking about, like I said, a group of nuns didn't want to be associated with birth control. I mean, you say that to most normal people, and they'll say, well, duh, they shouldn't have to be. And yet, for some reason, forcing this group, and I used to work for Senator Orrin Hatch on the Judiciary Committee, and we met with the leaders of the Little Sisters of the Poor, the dearest, sweetest ladies that you ever meet in your life. And the idea that somehow they've got to be forced to do this or all of our liberty is at stake is absolutely monstrously ridiculous.
Got to bring the nuns on to heel on this. I mean, whenever there's a cultural revolution underway, you know, the religious sisters are always a victim at some point or other. It's what we saw with the French Revolution, for sure. As I keep reminding our listeners, the French Revolution, the martyrs of Compiègne, the Carmelite sisters, were all sent to the guillotine just for the crime of being sisters.
And the Catholics were part of the other religious freedom decision today as well. You guys are really standing up for these fundamental rights these days because
tell us about that one. Tell us. Before I jump onto that one, I just want to make clear, though, the other interesting thing about this discussion with the Little Sisters, though, is that with Obamacare and with other government policies, we provide funding supposedly to Planned Parenthood so that they can provide contraception for free for anyone that wants it.
Oh, yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong here. So it's not like we're leaving women. Yeah, we give hundreds of millions for this particular thing so that they can give free contraception to any woman that wants it. So spare me, cry me a river. It was ridiculous, the whole thing. I thought it was all fraud. But at any rate, you're all covered if you want contraception. Just can you please not force the nuns to pay for it? But all right, let's go to the school decision.
And the other case involved what I think I wrote a piece that Heritage published today. About it, where I said the Supreme Court strengthened the separation of church and state, but for once this was a good thing. Most people think of the separation of church and state the wrong way, which is to keep religion out of the public sphere. This was a separation of church and state to keep the government out of the church. And the issue here was whether when a church or a religious school, in this case, makes decisions about who will teach their faith, in this case it was two Catholic schools, that they ought to be able to do so free of government interference. The schools fired a teacher, the teacher sued under the typical federal employment discrimination laws, and the question was whether the courts could step in and substitute their judgment for that of the religious schools. And the Supreme Court also 7-2, with the same two dissenters, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor, 7-2, the court said that the First Amendment provides protection for churches and religious schools, religious institutions, to make their own decisions about who will further their religious mission, who will teach their faith, who will inculcate their values to their students. A very important and very solid decision vindicating that very important principle. That's a separation of church and state, but it's separation in the right direction for the right reasons.
Yeah, I mean, because the people that took up this case were claiming that they were discriminated against, the two teachers, but the school said that was not the case.
Well, there was the differences of opinion about that, but the question is, if the free exercise of religion is a fundamental right, and if religious institutions have a very important interest in deciding for themselves, not necessarily who empties the trash or parks the cars, but who actually teaches the faith, then we've got to draw a line where government can't stick its nose into those decisions. Because don't forget, there's a lot of bogus employment discrimination claims filed too. And if we don't draw a definite, clear line here separating the two and allowing, at least with regard to these kinds of important positions, if we don't allow that churches and religious institutions and religious schools to make their own decisions on this, you're going to find increasingly that the government is using the courts to dictate to churches and dictate to religious schools who they've got to hire to further their own religious mission, and we can't have that. That's never been the nature of religious freedom in this country, and it shouldn't be now.